So I think first off, I'll say for our listeners, this is something that is, I think it's a first for us, and it's going to be really cool because Alex and I are sort of treating this less like this isn't only an episode of Discourse Lab. Alex DeVitry, who is with me, is also going to be releasing this on his Substack, which if you're listening through the Discourse Lab podcast, if you're listening on Apple or watching on YouTube, I'm going to encourage you to click the link in the description and go to that and subscribe to him. It's free. I don't think you're not charging anything yet, Alex, right?
Nothing, no. And I don't know that I ever will, but we'll see about that.
Yeah. Well, we'll see if you get big. You know, if it blows up, then you might be tempted to charge a couple bucks.
Yeah.
It's capitalism, babe. There's nothing wrong with it. And so, yeah, we're treating this less like an interview, me interviewing Alex, and more like a conversation between the both of us. And we're just going to talk about our perspectives, I imagine, which largely overlap in terms of our broad opinion on the conflict, but we have different areas of expertise and experiences. So we're going to bring hopefully our unique vantage points to this conversation. Does that sound about right, Alex?
Sounds about right. Yeah. I reached out to you, sometime last week. I said I wanted to keep my mouth shut about the conflict in Iran for the first few weeks of the war, just to let the conflict develop, and to not just add my voice to this crazy cacophony of voices that erupt at the beginning of every war. But I reached a point where I felt like I've seen enough. I'm ready to talk about it. And like you said, Clay, we come from two completely different backgrounds. So I also want to see the conflict through your eyes and get your view. So I reached out and just said, let's have a conversation. Let's record it and publish it just for, just to put it out there, let people critique us. Maybe we can improve ourselves.
Maybe we're both really way off and are stupid and someone will correct us.
Yeah.
So I'm always open to that too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, right? Because when this conflict kicked off, depending on who you were listening to, this was finally the liberation of the Iranian people, or it was the start of World War III. And that was going to kill, scores and scores of people and entire populations and everyone, right? Or it was Israel dragging us into their war and using us as their pawn. Mm-hmm. Spoiler alert, that one's especially stupid and not true. But, you were getting all these, like you said, crazy takes and predictions and things like that.
Yeah,
and I think it is smart that we sort of we decided let's take a beat and read some things and meditate and do all that. And so
then
hopefully we can, if we're not right, we'll at least bring some more.
Yeah, we'll have at least a more balanced view.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is we just need to let the conflict environment mature. When missiles start firing, too much is contingent. Too much is left up to chance. You have to let targets be struck. You have to let political decisions get made, and then see where things are after that process has gotten underway.
Yeah, because if there's one thing that we can all agree on about war, hopefully, is that it can be, and usually almost always is, highly unpredictable. It's a chaos machine.
Right.
But before we get into that, I actually think a good place to start, I will note that I think we might be having a slight lag, so let's just bear that in mind, and hopefully it clears up. I want to get your initial reaction, first couple of days it kicked off. What was your first impression? What were the thoughts going through your head? And then I'll share mine as well.
Yeah. So, you have your initial, oh shit, right? A lot of us saw this coming. I had published a short essay about 2 weeks before the first strike happened and Ali Khamenei was killed. So we knew that something was coming. I was kind of hoping that it was all a bluff and that there would be some negotiated outcome yet. The first flag of this conflict for me happened when Reuters published a report saying that they've spoken confidentially to 3 sources within the U.S. military, disclosing that we are planning for a quote-unquote weeks-long campaign. I didn't think that preparation was a bluff. But I also knew that when the military wants to do it, they know how to keep things secret. Leaks within the military are sometimes deliberate. Compare this leak weeks before the conflict first erupts with what happened in Venezuela. Nobody saw that coming. Nobody leaked that. That was out of the blue. So I hoped that what was happening was this was a deliberate leak to the press in order to signal to the Iranians who read all our
Mm.
news that we're serious, that we actually have plans, that this is not a bluff. Counterintuitively, that gives us some hope for diplomacy, because diplomacy is coercion sometimes too. And I was gambling on that for a while, well, until the first bombs hit, and then I decided to shut up and see what happens.
Yeah, I think it's weird because I feel like on one hand, you shouldn't have been and I shouldn't have been as surprised as we were that we got into this conflict with Iran, given Trump's history of being a wild card. And, there was a 12-day war last year. And so it's really not all that shocking when you think about it. And yet, we've been talking about war with Iran for how long? There have been certain politicians in our government who have been kind of pushing for it to one degree or another for so long. And it's one of those things where it's like, yeah, people want war with Iran, or people are saying it's inevitable, but like they keep saying it. And so you almost just like there's this subconscious thing that goes on where you're like, it'll never really happen, because it should be noted that Iran is responsible for the death of like roughly 1,000 Americans in the last couple decades, depending on how you count it. Their proxies, at least, right? It like first, second order kind of effects, right? Like their proxy groups that they fund and arm and train and all of these things. That number could go way up. They have just been constantly talking about how we're the great Satan and they want us to, people shout death to America. Like there is like reason. There was always reason for us to want to like check this regime, right?
Yeah.
And we'll get into it later, but I think there's different levels of analysis with this conflict in terms of how justified it is on ethical or moral grounds, and then also on legal grounds. And I think that's a point in the yes, this is actually a justified war from that perspective column. But I digress. So all of that kind of was there, and yet somehow it was still surprising. And so when I first saw this kickoff, I will say I was like shocked, kind of also shocked that I was shocked. I kind of reflected and was like, oh, why am I so surprised by this? And then the next thing was, I have to admit, I felt a certain kind of joy. I followed the protests that happened in January pretty closely and was just so horrified by the tens of thousands of people that this regime had slaughtered in a matter of days. Again, another point is this war justified column, right? On moral grounds, which doesn't necessarily mean it's a good idea overall. I want to be clear about that. We're going to get into that, but and I was also talking to a handful of people in the Iranian diaspora, and just getting their perspectives, and and just seeing things online as well, and just kind of got caught up a little bit in this feeling of, if you'll excuse my French, fuck these people good. And I still feel that way. I still think that Khamenei deserved to die, and the slew of leading Iranian officials in the Islamic Republic who have died also deserve to die. And I shed no tears for them. I'm not one of those people that says it's always bad when someone dies. Like, no, it's not. No one would say that about Hitler. Can we be real? Right. And I think these people are in that category. And so I think my first feeling, my first reaction was shock. My first feeling was joy. I was like, yeah, hell yeah, let's kill these guys. And then, of course, I didn't trust that because, as we were alluding to, it's like people have all these takes on it's World War III or this is the liberation of the Iranian people. And it's like, okay, I don't really know. I want to take a step back. And so then I sort of kind of took my foot off the gas, emotionally speaking, and just tried to figure out what the pros and cons of this are going to be.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that was my kind of initial reactions.
Yeah, and I think that's the reaction of a lot of us, of a lot of Americans. I certainly, I have more emotionally salient ties to the Middle East in general. Um, uh, but what that means for me is fuck those guys, right? Ali Khamenei
Right. Because you were in
and
the
Ali
Arab
Khomeini.
states.
Yeah, exactly. But I'm also steeped in uh, the politics of peoplehood and uh, regime construction and the relationship between populations and their governing regimes. And so for me, um, my oh shit reaction was much stronger than my fuck those guys reaction because I knew that um, uh, no matter how much these guys deserved to die, what we've just entered is a situation where we have to start thinking about least bad outcomes rather than best outcomes, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yes. Yes.
yeah, when the war began, um, my first order of thinking goes to nuclear analysis, right? And I'm not saying that, oh my God, Iran might have a nuke
Yes.
and they're going to drop it on us, but what I'm thinking about is what signal does this send to the world of nuclear proliferation? And how's that going to be received? What are the second and third order consequences of this across, say, the next 2 decades in the world of nuclear proliferation? That's the first place my mind goes. And then I go in levels of analysis in magnitude smaller and hone in on the region. Um, and then, of course, there's the whole Hormuz Strait thing, which I think, if I can plug it in here, and we'll talk more about it later, I think is the single
Mm-hmm.
most important and devastating political piece in this conflict is the way that the semi-closure of the Straits of Hormuz have played out in practice and what that means for American power over the next 2 decades.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I agree with that completely. That last point that actually I agree with both points, actually. The first one being that the signal I feel like this sends, I'm certain you'll agree with this. I'm pretty sure we're on the same page here. The signal that this sends is that it's good to have nukes because Iran doesn't have nukes. And the U.S. has done this really bombastic, played this really crazy hand, and attacked and decapitated this regime in a major way. And not just, again, Khamenei, but like a slew of leading officials. And so the signal that this sends is get nukes, right? You could even apply this, like you can apply this with Russia and the Ukraine war. Russia invades Ukraine. Would they have done that had Ukraine had nuclear weapons? Probably not. North Korea is another country that's been talking about, like America is evil and we hate you and blah, blah, blah. Why haven't we messed with them in decades? What was it, 75 years, something like that? It's because they have nukes. And so people are paying attention. World leaders are paying attention. And they're seeing, the countries that have nuclear weapons don't get invaded by their either powerful regional neighbors or, in the case of the United States, the sort of global hegemon, weakening though it may be, some may argue, still is the global superpower. So we don't have to worry about the U.S. and we don't have to worry about whoever it is, Russia, China, whatever. And so there is really almost an imperative to have nuclear weapons if you're thinking, oh, I want my regime or my way of life or my nation to survive in its current state. And then the second one, your second point you make being the Strait of Hormuz is extremely critical. We are staring down the barrel of a global energy crisis that we basically can't prevent because of very cheap drones.
Yes.
Like some of the least sophisticated military technology in the game right now, yet somehow also the most ingenious and effective. Right.
Right. Yeah.
So, yeah.
We'll get into the Straits of Hormuz and the drone thing. That's going to be, I think, the meat of our discussion later, because I'm gonna say something provocative now and then substantiate it later. I think
Ooh.
we have just collapsed the entire justification for world projection of power. So let's substantiate
Okay,
that
yeah,
later.
that's going to be interesting. I want to hear
Yeah.
your take on that. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, that's your
But
teaser.
before we move
So where should we start in this? Like,
yeah, I want to say a bit more about the nukes, because there's a counter argument that will come up. And in fact, it's a counter argument that comes up from some very well-read and educated thinkers on international strategy, and that is that every time something like this happens and people start saying that, oh, the U.S. intervened, we're sending the signal that everybody needs nukes. Nukes are fucking expensive, and so yes, maybe the petty dictator who staged the coup in Niger wants nukes. Coincidentally, they also have a lot of uranium. That's where a lot of our uranium has come from. Maybe he wants nukes, but nukes are a $2 trillion program, and he just doesn't have that, right? So that's a common counter argument to this worry that we're expressing about the signals that we're sending to the world. And that is totally valid if we're thinking in terms of what happens over the next 5 years, or say what happens specifically in states that have regimes that we don't like right now. But what I'm thinking about is the question of, say, what is the nuclear calculus that Canada has to make in 2060 if certain contingent trajectories of American politics takes a dark turn, right? Will Canada sometime between now and then decide, man, we really should develop nuclear deterrent against the United States, right? Or Mexico over the span of the
wow.
next 3 or 4 decades. So that's the time scale of signaling that I'm starting to think about, right?
I have to say that is a rather pessimistic, and I'm not like I can really sympathize or empathize with a somewhat more pessimistic view, like you're kind of outlining, but laying out. But that strikes me as almost too pessimistic. I feel like, I understand the trajectory we're on with Trump and some of this, and actually a lot of this concentration of power in the executive branch, the continuing escalation of Congress's ineffectiveness and sort of uselessness to a degree. These are all very concerning things, but it's hard for me to imagine a future where we're seriously threatening Canada. Even I don't know. Maybe I'm being too optimistic. That strikes me. It's hard to imagine a future where, but maybe it's easy to imagine a future where the Canadians get scared enough, rightly or wrongly, to consider that option.
Yeah. And
I don't know.
These are contingent outcomes, and I could lay out a version of the future and then substantiate that with arguments that promises this outcome. But it's contingent. This is a roll of the dice. We're talking in percentages of likelihood. And so there's just as much a percentage of likelihood that we proceed to a different future within certain bounds. It's beyond the scope of this conversation to get into the philosophy of the long 21st century in democracies and comparative politics. But yeah, it's about what people are afraid of more than it is about what will happen. So there's that to go on. But to pull us back to
it's about perception more than reality.
Yes, exactly. Bob Jervis, who I will cite again and again and again every time you talk to me, wrote a book called Perception and Misperception in International Politics. And this is one of his key insights, is that the unit that we need to analyze isn't what we think will happen. It is what we think other people think will happen and what they think we think will happen, right? So it's this game of, it's a psychological game.
It is. I mean, we won't get off on this tangent, but it is just it. I think one thing that people need to really understand, what you're outlining here, is international relations is such a crapshoot, and it's almost a fool's game. It's almost pointless because it is so endlessly complex, And there are so many dark horse events and things that happen where you're like, how did we not foresee this? But of course we never could have. And so it's like almost a bunch of like blind people stumbling around in the dark wearing earmuffs with just like no sense of what's actually happening. Sometimes I think it's like useless to even try. Of course, I don't really believe that fully, but it is like, be wary of people who give you extremely confident predictions, because there's literally no way that anyone could justify a certain level of confidence for predicting very specific outcomes. But I actually think it's important to stop here, because one of the biggest things that I hear about this debate about Iran, whether or not it was right to invade, whether or not they were really a threat to us, is this question of their nuclear program. Were they actually trying to develop a nuclear weapon? Were they ever intending to use a nuclear weapon? Even if they developed one, was it just to deter? I will say that and I'm no nuclear scientist, but as far as I understand, they were enriching uranium to 60%, which, as far as I know, there is literally no other use case for any significant amount, maybe a very, very small amount for research, but any significant amount of uranium enriched to 60%, other than to further enrich it to be used for nuclear weapons. To me, what that says is, and like you were saying, considering what they think we think, or what we think that they will be afraid of and they want, considering that sort of two steps removed thought process, like predicting their thought process, it makes all the sense in the world, and it does, to want a nuclear weapon for all the reasons that we just outlined. It is a deterrence. So for me, it seems very obvious that they really were trying to get a weapon, that any deal we were going to sign with them was just them delay. It was a delay tactic. It was a trick to buy themselves time and wiggle room to inch that program along in secrecy, as much secrecy as they could have, which apparently, because of the Israelis, is not very much.
Right.
But they were always going to try and get a bomb, right? Yeah, they were always going to try and get a bomb. The second question is, were they going to use that? And in my mind, that actually isn't, maybe this is a controversial thing to say, that actually isn't as important a question as the following question, which is, is the rhetoric that they've been using, and their posture, is it acceptable to assume that they aren't going to use the bomb, given that rhetoric? If that, I worded that poorly, but like, given the fact that they're talking about how they want to wipe Israel off the map, and that they have been funding terror groups that do all sorts of horrible things to innocent civilians and use all kinds of horrible tactics, and they've been doing this for decades, and they're, I think, fairly responsible. Actually, they do have a fair amount of responsibility for the horror we've seen in Gaza, because of the groups that they've been propping up that have been kneecapping that society's ability to move forward in a positive way, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Given the fact that they talk about the U.S. as the great Satan and how they, want to destroy us and destroy our allies and blah, 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 I'm not willing to accept any argument that, like, but that's just posturing. There's a certain amount of posturing that's like, well, that's not acceptable. You don't get to say that we want to destroy all these people and commit all these genocides and then try to get a nuclear bomb and be like, well, we didn't mean it. It's like, no, you don't get to play that game. There has to be a line somewhere. So that's my thought on it, and I'm curious to get yours, Alex.
So I've just jotted down 3 things that I think is important to talk about in this area. The first is about the nuclear enrichment. This is obviously beyond both of our areas of expertise. My understanding, just if I'm casting my mind back to a course that I had the privilege of taking with an expert on Iran, energy geopolitics, 60% is the threshold for civilian use, and then 90% or 95% is the threshold for weaponization. But I don't know that for sure. And so I think it would be irresponsible for me to say, no, I don't think you're right, or for me to say, yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I don't know. That's something we got to look up. As far as their getting a nuclear weapon, I lean on the other side. I lean on the the side that says I don't think that they were actively seeking a weapon. I think that they were not necessarily committed to not having one, but I see no evidence that they were. And the reason that I say this is, one, the IAEA, which is the United Nations body for nuclear energy and nuclear regulation, said that they found no evidence that the Iranians were seeking a nuclear weapon. And then the second thing is the fatwa from Ali Khamenei banning nuclear weapons, saying that they are haram. The Iranian regime are many things, but hypocrites they are not. They take their religious convictions very seriously. And a fatwa from a grand ayatollah is not something that seems to me like they can get an entire government of people to say, yes, we're projecting a fatwa from the Ayatollah publicly, but we're secretly undermining that. Knowing what I know, coming from the background that I come from, seems like that would be asking these people to go to hell in order to get a weapon, right? And that's,
well, that is assuming that those people are as religious as they claim, or as others
right.
claim that they are, which I
Right.
think is somewhat of a gray area. Even people who profess to be religious often don't know much about their religion and just might, you know what I mean? Like, I think there is some wiggle room. And I want to be clear that you should check us on our math here with the uranium thing. But I did quickly Google it. And this is I want to make sure that what I said wasn't complete BS. This is from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. I don't know exactly how reputable they are.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm just going to read quickly a paragraph from this, and I'll include the link in the bio, in our bio, and I'm sure you will too. 60% was not an arbitrary choice. Cascades of centrifuges are designed to enrich uranium in steps. Iran's centrifuges are likely set up to enrich up to 20%, from 20 to 60, and then from 60 to 90%. Assuming the 60% enriched uranium is stored in the form of uranium hexafluoride gas, and there would be no point in Iran converting it to any other chemical form. Yep. The enrichment step from 60% enriched to weapons-grade uranium is very short. This strongly suggests that Iran's decision was intended to send a political message. We have gone as far as we can go in response to provocations without producing weapons-grade uranium. I will also point out that based on what I have Googled, again, so take that with a grain of salt, that 3 to 5% enrichment is what is required for civilian use.
Oh, wow.
So I do think there is a possible... Yeah. So when you say threshold, it's like threshold for what is considered... I don't know. Actually, I don't want to qualify that too much. I think what's important to note, if what I have just read off is accurate, I'm fairly certain it is. This comports with other things I've read in the past. Is that it seems like it's the possible kind of middle ground is that they weren't necessarily going to build a bomb, but A, they wanted to be in a position where they could relatively quickly if they decided to, and B, they were trying to assume a threatening posture because they can say we don't have weapons grade uranium. It's this sort of like a quantum zone where two things are kind of true and false at one time, right? Where it's like, we don't have weapons grade uranium. We have no plans to officially produce weapons grade uranium as officially, right? We have we haven't decided to do it. While at the same time posturing to other nations that, hey, we could make it very quickly. And we have the uranium and the capability to enrich it to 90%.
Right. And I do think
everyone knows this is what's going on, right? Because everyone knows that you only need 5% at the most for civilian use.
I do think that is actually what happened. I think, I can compare to, he wasn't nearly as far along in his program, but Muammar Gaddafi actually used that exact logic. He wanted a program that could produce a bomb, but he wanted to freeze the program before he got there so that he could use it as a negotiating chip with the United States. And then after the invasion in 2003, he quickly decided that it's time to cash in that chip and abandon his nuclear abandoned his nuclear hopes after he saw what happened to Saddam Hussein, right? So
Right.
yeah, that
Saddam,
makes
again,
sense to me.
this is another interesting example. Like Saddam is an example of this thing we're talking about trying to predict what other people are thinking and what they think
Mhm.
you're thinking. There's this great book that the title was escaping me, that kind of outlines how like Saddam assumed that the CIA would know that he wasn't actually making weapons of mass destruction while he was publicly saying he was making weapons of mass destruction. And
Yes.
he was like saying this to kind of boast to his regional allies, but he was like, but the US won't take me seriously because their CIA is so good. They know it's not true. And we didn't know it wasn't true. So that was a huge blunder in that kind of game that he was playing of assuming we knew what we actually didn't know for sure.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah. He's also,
and it should be said, Gaddafi, everything worked out well for him. So,
Yeah. Saddam Hussein is also such an important figure to actually bring up now, because what we're dealing with right now is the ghost of Saddam Hussein. The Iranian nuclear project originally, when it was established, was not established with Israel or the United States in mind. It was established with Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was the biggest enemy of the Iranian regime before his death in 2004. So much of Iran's aggression and military mentality comes from the 8 years of the Iran-Iraq War. And indeed, most of the senior leadership today that are being targeted by Israel and America are veterans of that war. They came of age in that war. That's how they rose to leadership. The Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who was just killed, was the president of Iran during that war. And so the posture of threat, of encirclement, of this cornered bear attitude really starts with their relationship with Saddam Hussein. And then after Saddam Hussein falls, they expand it to Israel and the United States because they need it. The regime needs it to stay in power.
Yeah. Yes, that's a very good point. And it should be noted that the Iran-Iraq War was a particularly bloody, and gruesome war. I mean, it was pretty awful, right? Which had an effect on the psychology of the Iranian leadership and people. I don't want to spend too much more time on the nuclear question. I want to move on, but I do want to ask you your opinion of this. Is there not a logic to saying, okay, here's the deal. You don't get to play footsie with nuclear weapons. As long as the U.S. has global hegemonic power, you either have nuclear weapons and we'll play ball with you, but if you try to get them, at the very least, if you try to get nukes or even posture like you might get nukes and are also talking about eviscerating, destroying us and our allies or anything of the sort like that, we're not going to play that game with you. We're going to come and decapitate your regime and keep doing it until you get in line. Is there not a certain logic to that of like, listen, you might even be able to get away with developing nukes if you're nice to us, if you play ball with us, right? And so is that, I'm just wondering, is there not a logic to that? Like, it should be noted, I made that maybe in poor taste joke about Gaddafi, everything working out for him, because that certainly is not the case. Another guy whose death, I don't want to say I celebrated because he did deserve it because he was an awful human being, but no one deserves to die the way he died. It was pretty awful. So you have him, and you have him as this example of like, well, okay, well, don't trust the U.S. Get your nuclear weapons, because even if you give them up, they're not going to come for you. They're not going to save you when you need them to, and they're going to kind of keep up their end of the bargain. But maybe we can spin that as, you know what, you should have just never played nuclear chicken with us in the first place because it will never work out well for you. I'm wondering if you think that could possibly work.
In the world into which you and I were born and grew up in, yes. One of my theses that I press on my Substack, which I could make the argument for if you'd like me to, but I think it's secondary to what we want to talk about for the rest of the conversation, is that world is gone. And what we are doing is, I hate to reach for this metaphor, but it's what comes to mind because it's what Nietzsche used when he talked about the secularization and why secularization he thought was a threat to Western society. We are playing in its corpse as it rots around. That is a strategy that can work when we have an international system, a rules-based international order with a sense of international law and an agreement that everybody plays by these same rules. The reason that it only works in that kind of world is because strength, especially brute force strength and hard power, is impermanent and contingent. And it relies on layers of soft power to prop it up. As we degrade our soft power in ways that we can't recover from, right? So there's no rewind button that says, sorry guys, we screwed up. Let's get all our soft power back. Let's get our international reputation back. Not for another 100 years can we do that feasibly. In that kind of world, we might be able to get away with doing that to Iran. So we start a mow the grass strategy with Iran. Just every time they reach a point where we think they're going to get nukes, bombs, rockets. Strait of Hormuz is a problem that shows us that we can't rely on that without significant international help. But say we get that for the Iran case. We build an international containment system and we keep mowing the grass. What happens if Brazil decides that they're going to start a nuclear program? Or what happens if China decides to covertly start helping Chile, with whom they have good relationship, developing a nuclear program? So now we've got 3 nations around which we must build a containment strategy and on whom we must spend multi-million-dollar munitions every few years in aircraft that cost billions of dollars. Right. So you can see how this might work for 2 years or 5 years or 10 years. But as a grand strategy, we just don't have the money to do this every single time. Other actors will notice. They're not dumb. They will notice that we have a hard cap. Maybe we can restrict 7 nations at a time from getting nukes. Nation number 8 will go for it. Right. So that's kind of my thought process. Yeah, short term, limited case, it can work, but it can't be our rule of thumb. It can't be our go-to for managing nuclear risk across the 21st century.
I don't know. I guess the only thing I think I largely agree with you, but just to play devil's advocate, some of the countries you listed aren't necessarily diametrically opposed adversarially to the United States. You know what I mean? Like, so Chile, maybe we have better or worse relations with them, but they're not talking about how we're the great Satan. They're not funding terror groups to hit some of our closest allies.
Right.
This is way beyond the scope of this conversation, but I will admit my bias here. I am a fan of the Israeli-American partnership for all sorts of reasons that relate to Israel really being able to hold up their end of the partnership very well.
Neither was Iran, right? Neither was Iran until 1979.
Yeah.
So, these things change.
Yeah, but sure, but I think that's a unique case for a lot of reasons. I mean, again, this goes way beyond the scope of this conversation, but like, I don't know, people have misconceptions about that where they're like, oh, Mossadegh was a democratically elected leader. It's like, not really in the sense that you're thinking, and also he was consolidating power in a way that like he was acting like he had some Trumpian qualities, except in a system that wasn't as good at containing those instincts. So like he really was like not the great populist leader in the sense that, anyway, I digress.
No, he was. I mean, he was appointed by
and
the
there
parliament.
were yeah, he was, yes, exactly, like and doing some shady things, but I'm not saying that justifies what we did per se, but it's a little more gray than that. And also like even considering like all the mistakes and the blunders we made in the late 70s, like I'm not sure that justifies the rhetoric that was coming out of the regime. I mean, this was not, hey, you owe us, you really screwed us, we need to have a hard conversation. This was like, we want you to die. Like, so it's still not, it's like, but I digress. I do want to move on though. So we've kind of covered this nuclear question. I think we can just, I feel like we've ended up in a place where it's like, it's fair to argue a lot of different sides of that issues because it was intentionally ambiguous on the part of the Iranians. So it's very fair to argue that, hey, they're going to try and get a bomb. It's also very fair to argue that they weren't, that they were just, this was just a political maneuver. But let's get into the current conflict. I think let's just kind of actually recap this decapitation that happened. I think this is important for people to understand just how nuts this is. I mean, like I've said this several times already, but like, it's not just Khomeini. A bunch of very senior and important leaders were taken out within days, weeks. And so I'm curious. Actually, let me ask you, Alex, what is your take on the effect that has had and will continue to have?
Yeah. So there's no question at all that the assassination strategy degrades the capacity of the regime, right? Um, there's one good argument that explains why they just started popping off missiles at everybody around them with seemingly no discernment for their targets. And that is that with the decapitation, the regime actually fractured, right? Internally, nobody knew what the hell to do. And so you had these local military commanders that are just like, fuck it, shoot everything, right? So that's one story you could tell to explain this.
Yeah.
I think it's not the only story, but it's a good one. And it matches what we see from the outside. So there's no doubt that the decapitation has seriously hurt the regime. The questions that I'm asking, and I'm kind of seeding the answer into here, the answer is no, in my view, are do they degrade the regime sufficiently enough that it can no longer pose a cohesive threat? I think no. I think that if they did shatter the regime, it has regrouped and has developed a new strategy that it didn't have earlier in the conflict. Have they done so in a manner that will allow an organized group within the country to rise up and replace them? No, that's not going to happen, I don't think. Have they reduced the external threat that Iran poses to its neighbors? Yeah, absolutely. I think so. Iran has a lot less explodey things that it can shoot at Israel, right? That's a success.
Yes.
But
yeah, I read somewhere. Oh, sorry, I'm just going to jump in and say to underline that point. I read, and I'm forgetting where I read this actually. I wish I could cite the source, but as I understand it, the rate of fire of their missiles has gone down by like 90% since the start of the conflict, and that in large part, I from what I understand, is just the fact that they are running out, and they don't want to like completely run out too quickly, so they're being more conscious of how often they are firing. Those
I do have some clarity.
We will
on
talk
that.
about
that the statistic comes from the Pentagon. Comes from the Secretary of. I refuse to call him the Secretary of War. I'm sorry. I'm gonna let my bias in here just a little bit. The Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, announced that, but it was it was verified by CSIS, which is a think tank, and the Institute for the Study of War also verified this. OSINT Defender is an X account that is worth following, that is really good on open source intelligence. They independently verify stuff like this, and they confirmed it. So I believe it, that the rate of fire really has declined. But the reasons for that are up for interpretation, and experts differ. Some say, yeah, no, Iran just is running out of missiles. Others say, well, sure, we've blown up a lot of their missiles, but also they're being a lot more strategic in choosing what they shoot missiles at than they were at first. So we don't know exactly why, but it did happen, and we know that a hell of a lot of their missiles were blown up. So that makes a lot of sense, right?
Yeah. So either way, their capacity to do damage to the Arab states and to Israel has gone down. We just don't know quite by how much. Yeah, and so, but as we will talk about pretty soon here, I don't think the missiles are the most interesting ordnance that they are using. Their long range, like their ballistic missiles, are not the most.
You want to jump into that? Let's talk about drones.
Thing. Let's just jump. Yeah, let's talk about drones because drones have basically been a revolution in military affairs, in combat, right? We've seen this in the Ukraine war. where drone technology and then drone defense technology have been just accelerating at a rapid pace, because you have actually the same kinds of drones, these Shahed or Shahed, I'm not, I think it's Shahed, is it Shahed? Shahed drones that Iran makes and gives to or sells to Russia have been used in that theater, and the Ukrainians have been developing ways to counter these in all sorts of interesting ways. And so actually, I think the Ukrainians may prove a useful, in fact, I'm sure they certainly will prove to be a useful ally in figuring out how to counter these drones, because they have been getting exceedingly good at it. Um, the important thing to note about these drones, if you don't already know, is that you, the listener, I know you know, Alex, is that they're very cheap compared to a missile. I mean, they're several orders of magnitude cheaper and simpler to produce than a like long-range ballistic missile or a ballistic missile or an anti-aircraft missile or any of these things, right? And they're so effective because you can create swarms of them. They're small, they're agile. If you send 100 out and 98 get shot down and one hits a ship or an airfield right in the right place, it can have extremely devastating consequences for that target. And so this is why the Strait of Hormuz is still closed down effectively, is because even though it is reasonable to assume that the capacity of the Iranian missile forces to launch missiles at passing ships is greatly reduced, and that we do have some ability to deflect those missiles or to intercept them, yet, in spite of this, the strait is still closed down because those drones are the really tough thing. There are also mines. We should talk about the mines as another huge portion of this, but these drones have just been a total game changer. Because again, it's like we're spending how many millions on per missile in the United States, and the Iranians can spend a couple thousand on a drone. I mean, it's wildly disproportionate.
It's a moped engine stuck to, some plywood and C4, right?
That's the best way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah. I want to ask you a question on something, because there's one professor who actually I recommend you try to get him on the air. His name is Stephen Biddle. If you look him up, he's a military analyst. He teaches at the War College and here at Columbia. And he has a different view on the role of drones. He thinks that they are overrated, and that they have not significantly changed the underlying structure of war in general. So that's a fascinating conversation. You might want to do a whole episode on. Yeah, if you get the chance to get him, I highly recommend. Yeah, but let's go with this, because I think the idea that the drones are a revolutionary technology. This is a widespread idea that is worth running with as far as we can take it. Do you think that we will maintain this imbalance in the cost of defense technology versus the cost of these drones? Or do you think we've got a good chance of evening that out, either through technological innovation or maybe a change in our doctrine even? Because this is a big challenge for us to face right now as a military.
Absolutely. I actually, again, predicting is a very risky thing to do with this sort of thing, but I actually think that it will not take us all that long in the grand scheme of things to find a way to counter these things. I think it is a combination of matching the same kind of build techniques, construction techniques for these drones, basically a moped engine with some C4, blah, 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 blah. We have the funds, certainly, to build huge swarms of drones and huge fleets of drones. And then with our increased, our much far superior wealth and economic power, combining that with AI so that you have these highly adaptable drones that are maybe controlled from a central command and control point, I think those acting as a sort of a drone shield against much dumber drones is something I would expect to develop. I think of companies like, for example, the ever nerdily named Palantir, which, as I understand it, is a Lord of the Rings reference. Of course it is.
It is indeed. Yeah.
Or what is it? Arundel?
Arundel is another one. Yeah. Yeah. I'm a massive nerd. Yeah.
I will say again, nothing has nothing to do with what we're talking about. I have all 3 books and am planning on reading them this year. Specifically for something I'm writing on Substack, but that I digress. All of these nerdily named companies that are leveraging that sort of technology, I'm expecting that. I bet right now they're just like at the drawing board, losing their minds, trying to figure out how can we bring something effective to scale and sell it to the government, because A, they'll make money, and B, because I really do think guys like, was it Palmer Luckey, really are sort of, as I like to say, red, white, and blue pilled. And I think they have that kind of attitude. But yeah, the short answer to your question is yes, I do expect that we will find ways to counter it. Until we do that, we are in a real pickle. And we are in a pickle because of those drones, because, again, it's this cheap, effective. And we should also mention, as you sort of alluded to early in the conversation, those drones and all the advantages they bring mixed with this, what they're, I believe, calling mosaic structure of the Iranian military. So what that means is it's what you were describing. It's this decentralized structure, which obviously has its drawbacks, right? As you said, it can cause people to do these irrational things that aren't in sync with what other commanders are doing, and so it causes those kinds of issues. But it also allows for these units to operate independently. And that flexibility combined with this drone technology has allowed that military to remain effective to some degree, regardless of the fact that their entire leadership structure has been exploded. And that's huge. That's a big thing. And then when you have this mosaic structure in this, it should be said, very mountainous country with all sorts of tricky terrain, you're talking about different units and different military apparati that can sort of might be hard to actually pin down and destroy. So that is a huge problem for the Americans and the Israelis. It's like you can kill all the leaders, but then you're going to have these rogue elements just sort of going off and wreaking havoc, which it is very easy to do in a small choke point like the Strait of Hormuz. There's a great piece in the Free Press by the historian Niall Ferguson, who he compared this to the Dardanelles in the First World War. It was this similar kind of story, except with wheat instead of oil or fossil fuels. And it really is the same story. You have this tiny choke point that all of this important shipping needs to go through, because it's so narrow. It's just so easy to wreak havoc in such a small space. I mean, this goes back to like the 300. Why is it so easy? Why was it so easy for the Greeks to defend this tiny pass against the Persians?
Yeah.
Well, it's because it funneled them in at Thermopylae, because it funnels them into this tiny space that's very, very easy to control, and it's terrain, right? Even thousands of years later, our warfare is so dependent still upon terrain when we're fighting the Persians, right?
Yes. Yeah.
But the other thing I should mention again and go into more detail is the mines. So you have the drone problem, but let's say we Palmer Luckey wakes up tomorrow with this golden solution that combines AI and drone, our own swarms of drones to like counter these Iranian drones, and we build out this fleet of drones super, super quick, and all of these things go perfectly right. We still have the mines, and so these underwater sea mines, basically, that will wreak havoc on any ship going through this. Again, lots of mines, tiny space, means that there's this high density of explosives in this tiny waterway. It's going to take weeks to clear that minefield. So even if we got rid of the drones right now, the Iranians completely surrendered. There was a revolution in the streets of Tehran. The people take over. We have this glorious democratic. Our wildest dreams come true. In terms of Iran becoming this free and prosperous place that we can now go and vacation to, which, God, I would give anything to be able to do. That would be so cool. All of that goes right. We still have weeks of minesweeping. And the reason this is a problem, and this is the other part of the Strait of Hormuz that we need to get into, is that's weeks of fossil fuels not being transported through that strait. And something like 20% of the global oil supply, of the global fossil fuel supply, goes through the Strait of Hormuz. And when you cut that off, it's very basic economics, right? Again, I should caveat, I'm not an economist, but it's supply and demand. There's always demand for energy. It's very high. And when you cut that by a fifth, prices go up.
I want to
And
jump
so
in
we're
on
staring down
this.
the barrel of an
And
energy crisis.
yeah,
Yes, go.
yeah.
Sorry,
I
I've
want to
been
jump
rambling
in
on
and
for a long
say
time.
that, here in the United States, where you and I both live and are from, we primarily experience energy crises as an increase in price. So we pay more at the pump. That's the first round.
Yes.
Second, we
Yeah.
experience it as an increase in consumer good prices across the board because everybody's got to pay more to ship stuff. That's how we experience it. But it's also important to remember that an energy crisis means a hell of a lot more for a lot of people around the world. There are 8 billion of us that are all trying to get our fuel. And so we're in a situation now where we've got schools in the Philippines are shut down because they can't run the electricity because of the energy crisis. We have especially these Asian nations, Philippines, Indonesia, they're facing a suffocation in public services. Garbage isn't being picked up because they can't buy the fuel for their trucks. We have the wealth, nationally speaking, that even when the price hits 120 tonight, it's $107 a barrel,
Mm-hmm.
or even if it goes back up to post-COVID rates and hits $120 a barrel, we still have the national wealth to keep the tankers coming to our ports. There are a lot of nations out there who have these really pressing interests in getting tankers to their ports, right? And they don't have our wealth to attract those tankers to pull that global oil supply back towards them. So they have to resort to other methods. Some of those methods are calling
Yeah.
the Iranians and saying, "Hey, what can we do to arrange an exemption for our ships?" You know, Italy just
Mm-hmm.
did
Mm-hmm.
that.
And that gives them leverage.
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
Yes, it does. And this
Yes, it
leads
does.
to
It should also. Let me just jump in here and say it is also important to note that we are a net energy exporter. We can produce all of the energy we need, so that further insulates not just our wealth, it's the fact that we actually have the fossil fuel reserves in our ground in the
yes,
United States,
yeah. And
which
so
makes it does suck. It does suck for the Americans when you have to pay more at the pump, and that does have effects, but it's not nearly, like you said, what it is for someone in the
right.
Philippines or
And
Italy
I
or
want to make
anywhere in
clear
Europe.
that, like, I'm not making the, oh, think of the poor African children tired appeal, even though there's a moral value to be had in considering the needs of other human beings around the world. But I'm making a strategic appeal, because what happens when other nations pick up the phone and call someone to get their ships through the Strait of Hormuz? A de facto declaration of who is actually in control of the freedom of navigation is made by that phone call. Who do they call? If they call the United States, then the United States is in control of the world's freedom of navigation. If they call Iran to ask for their ships to be allowed through the Straits of Hormuz, Iran is in control of navigation through that strait, not us. So this
Mm-hmm.
has a serious
Mm-hmm.
implication for our projection of power worldwide. As you know, Clay, the foundation of American naval projection is the guarantee for freedom of passage. Um, I cannot think. You have to go back to the tanker
Yes.
wars of the 80s to think of a time where America's guarantee for freedom of navigation has been this um, um, restricted in any waterway in the world, any international waterway in the world. Even the South China Sea conflict between them and the Philippines was not this. We were
Mm-hmm.
still making freedom of navigation patrols right through that waterway while that was going on, right? Nobody dared touch one of our boats. Um, but Iran
Mm-hmm.
dared to touch one of our boats. They hit one of our oilers, you know, uh, and then they're
Yes.
hitting American flag tankers, and tankers of every other nation, right? So there's serious implications to the fact that other nations are experiencing the crush of this energy crisis much worse than we are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's also, you mentioned Italy. It's bad politics to a degree, to a large degree. Like we're screwing over our European allies because they aren't nearly as energy independent as we are. They aren't out energy independent, it should be said. And so they're getting hit with this so much harder than we are. Now, they wouldn't be hit quite so hard if certain countries hadn't shut down all of their nuclear plants, which is, again, neither here nor there. It's
Germany.
not part of this conversation, but just Germany. And then you have the stupid Green Party in Germany posting about how great it is that they've just completely themselves in terms of energy resilience, with like the least carbon intensive or least carbon emitting form of energy ever.
Yeah.
But I digress.
Full disclosure,
fact, I
I am
haven't
a
looked into this,
nuclear
but-
YIMBY. I'm a nuke bro. I want nuclear
too.
energy to be
Me
our
too.
basis. Yeah.
Yes. It's very, very little drawbacks when compared to fossil fuels. In fact, I mean, we'll save that for the next episode. Actually,
Another
that you
one,
and I
yeah.
do, the next conversation we have. We'll save it. But I will say, actually, I haven't looked into this, but I'd be willing to bet the country in the EU that's feeling the pain the least is France, because they still have their nuclear power plants up. That's not to say that they aren't hurting, but I bet they're not hurting as bad as Germany. But yeah, that's neither here nor there. We'll talk about that in another episode. Yes, I think you bring up some extremely good points, that this is another moment of that. Unfortunately, it looks like we could, depending on how this plays out, we don't know for sure yet, be displaying to the world a further weakening of American ability to be the world police. And perhaps you disagree with this, but I actually think when you weigh the good and the bad together, the pros and cons, America being the global police officer has been overwhelmingly good for humanity. Yes, Vietnam was not so great. Yes, we have done shitty things with the Iran-Contra scandal, and I mean, we've done lots of shitty things in Iran. Yes, America is not without many sins, but the level of the explosion, I should say, of human well-being in the post-World War II global order, U.S.-led global order, the explosion of literacy, the crashing of death rates for women in labor, the explosion of I already said literacy, the explosion of access to health care. I could go on and on and on. Has been remarkable. And it is pretty much entirely due to the fact that the U.S. said, you know what? We're going to, like you said, allow free trade globally over the sea, on our globe's oceans. And no one's going to fuck with anyone, or they're going to fuck with us. And the reason this is so important, actually, I won't go too into it. I'll recommend a book. It's called The End of the World is Just the Beginning by Peter Zeihan. He, in my opinion, does a better job than most of explaining just how great the post-World War II global order was, and how it functioned, and the logic behind it, and why it was so remarkable and so historically unique. But to give a very, 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 very brief summary, free trade over the oceans means that you have to spend way less money on defending the things that you are transporting, and you can maximize efficiency for transporting goods across our globes, the oceans of our globe. And this just has all these great compound effects for economic efficiency, economic growth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the result of the global order. And so if we see this further fracturing of global norms, of international norms and international politics, international relations, of this fracturing of U.S. power, and the respect and fear that the U.S. military commanded, so that no one would dare touch us in the example you just gave, when I'm forgetting, oh my gosh, the Chinese, help me out here.
The conflict in the South China Sea between China and Philippines.
South China Sea was the phrase I was looking for, and it completely left my brain. That world seems to be going away, and that's very scary. And so that's maybe one big check mark in the con column for this conflict. Is it is further accelerating this world, our journey to this world where we have a lot more regional powers, a multipolar world, which some people are excited for and think is a good thing. I beg to differ.
You and I are largely on the same page there. In my writing, you will find many prolific critiques of American foreign policy, of American adventurism. I am almost always an anti-interventionist, but my critiques, while they have a moral piece to them are primarily from the angle of the impact it has, the negative impact it has on American power, right? On our ability to do this uh, uh, projection of power that you talked about. Um, I'm gonna take a bit to talk about what we both described as the crumbling of American power around the world and the impact that I think that will have. Um, the political philosopher Vlad Vexler likes to say that there are two kinds of imperialism. There's malign imperialism, and there is such a thing as benign imperialism. Benign imperialism has at least morally neutral value. Um, Malign imperialism, we have engaged in it as much as any other, but a great current example of malign imperialism is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And America intervening in that conflict on behalf of Ukraine would be an example of benign imperialism. Yes, we are being imperial. We are projecting our power far beyond our borders to interfere in the politics of others, which is one of the common definitions of imperialism. But it's good that we're doing it, right? Because the outcomes are good for humanity and good for the values that we agree on. Mm-hmm. One of the things that American power has done since World War II is depress the likelihood of political violence. Political violence happens because of structural issues. There are drivers that, when they are present, will create political conflict. There are many theaters in the world in which the drivers for political conflict are present and pushing towards war. But the United States has, for many decades, depressed that potentiality for war so that they can maintain this international system of trade and globalization, which has its drawbacks that we must talk about. I think globalization hasn't been good for everybody. There have been losers here at home.
Oh,
even,
yeah.
You know,
I will say this phrase again and again until the day I die. The greatest phrase in regards to international or domestic politics ever uttered was uttered by Thomas Sowell, and it's "There's no solutions, only trade-offs." And that applies to literally
I agree with that. I agree with that. I don't always agree with Thomas Sowell, but he's damn right there. Yeah. So what is happening as we immolate our soft power voluntarily, often things like the cutting off of USAID is a great example of just totally voluntarily taking a shotgun and blowing our own foot off. As we continue to do this, our capacity to suppress that violence decreases. And so we get the pop-up of conflicts and wars. The conflict recently between India and Pakistan was a great example of this. That has high potential to lead to a cascade of nuclear escalation, right?
Right. Both nuclear powers.
Yeah, both nuclear powers. But even when the actors don't have nukes, the rate of war will increase. What that means for us domestically as Americans, just American citizens, you and me that read the news in the morning, we are going to experience subjectively a greater level of anxiety in the world around us as we hear more and more about wars happening at a rate far higher than they did when we were kids. And when a population in general has a high anxiety level, when we're worried about the way that the world is going, because there's more violence, even if it's not happening to us, we make stupid choices, right? That we don't think as a people at the top of our game, which will then lead to more decisions that fracture our power even more, and we get a vicious cycle. That's the engine of the kind of pessimistic worldview that I express. I don't express it because I think it's guaranteed that we're going in that direction, but I express it as kind of a warning that, like, hey, we've got this dynamic starting to pick up. And a big project of my Substack, when I think about political violence and political peoplehood, is what do we have to do psychologically to ourselves or culturally to be able to still flourish and tolerate this increase in political violence that we're going to see.
No, it's I'll quote another. I'll make another nerdy reference. Frank Herbert's Dune, fears
Hell
the
yeah.
mind killer.
Yes.
Just saw the trailer for they're coming out with the third movie. Another book I haven't read, but I've seen the movies, just like with Lord of the Rings.
It's worth the read, man. Yeah.
But that's so true. I'm sure it is. But I have a stack of nonfiction that I'm trying to read, and it's hard for me to like take a break to read fiction. But I digress. Yes, that is very true. That in a higher anxiety world, a higher fear world, that sort of has a cascading, a snowball effect. People make less intelligent, more fear-based decisions, which leads to a higher threat level. And globally speaking, more anxiety, more threat-based decisions, fear-based decisions, and it sort of snowballs. And that's how you get world wars. But we've been awful pessimistic in this conversation. I'm wondering if you're willing to switch over, because like we said at the beginning, war is a chaos machine. Anything can happen. Sometimes it's more predictable, like, Saddam's invasion of Kuwait. Like, we got an international coalition of partners, kicked him out of Kuwait. It was that one was pretty clean by, as far as conflicts go. But oftentimes they're extremely messy, like the First World War, for example. And the Gallipoli campaign that I mentioned earlier in the Straits of the Dardanelles Straits, absolute train wreck. And I'll include a link to Niall Ferguson's piece. That was very interesting. But what about the case where the U.S. actually comes out of this on top, and U.S. and Israel, I should say, and we actually manage to either, in the best case scenario, facilitate a transition from one regime to another, and that new regime being one that is far more U.S. friendly, far more democratic, maybe not super democratic at the beginning, but, creates a pathway to democracy and all these good things. Or at least a sort of Venezuela situation where we get a Delcy Rodriguez type character who I'm sure, like Delcy, will be a horrible person who also, when they die, won't be shedding any tears. But they were at least now calling us instead of, China or Russia or whoever else to see if what they're doing is okay. And we have some control, and they stop funding terror organizations. And, even that would be a boon to a much lesser one, but a boon to the people of Iran, right?
Yeah.
Something like that happens. I'm curious to know, I want us to talk about A, how that might happen, but more importantly, B, what would the effects of that be? And I think maybe a good place to start is, we're talking about the U.S., kind of the U.S. collapse of the U.S. empire, right? That people like to talk about, like the U.S. hegemony is going down the toilet. The big thing that people talk about with that is China, and how China is the sort of giant global geopolitical adversary to us that either will take our place or at least will get up to our level and will be this sort of bipolar world with us and China. Mm-hmm. An important thing about this conflict that people need to know, and I'm sorry, I've been reading a lot of the Free Press. I feel like I know that maybe they're somewhat controversial outlet. I like them, but they have a really good, like the people that get to talk about these things have really interesting takes. And one of my favorite people on this is Haviv Redding-Gur. And he makes a very compelling argument that this is the lower level game that the U.S. is playing, and the higher level 3D chess game that we're playing is actually with China. And the important thing to understand about China's place in all this is that they get a large percentage of their oil demands met by Iran. And China is not well, in a sense it is and it isn't. I'll get into it. But China is not a secure country in terms of energy because they have a high energy demand. They can't really produce any significant amount of energy within their borders. And so being able to control or cut off their access to fossil fuels could be a huge leverage point for the United States. Gigantic. It is worth noting that they're investing in nuclear and all that, and they do have a very large reserve, but still, they are a country of, well, actually, they're a much smaller country than they've been claiming to be, but they still have several 100 million people, probably just south of 1 billion, actually. They've been saying it's like over 1 billion. Turns out that's not true, but it's still an extremely large country with an extremely large energy demand, right? And so by controlling the Strait of Hormuz and being able to turn the Iranian tap on and off, the U.S. would have position itself in an extremely beneficial way in its global kind of contest with China. Now, the flip side of that, I know I'm going on for a long time, Alex, so I'll let you jump in here in a sec, but the flip
by
side
all
of
means,
that,
man.
which was also which was also in the Free Press, which is, again, why I actually really like the outlet on this particular issue, is they are airing both voices in a really interesting way. And I'm forgetting the author's name, forgive me. But the flip side of that is the fact that China might actually see this war as good for them, because the U.S. is using up so much of its stockpile of munitions, particularly when it comes to missile interception, right? So our Patriot systems that sort of intercept incoming missiles that we like load on ships. So if we don't have a lot of reserve of those, if they decide to go after Taiwan, our ability to defend Taiwan is extremely degraded. And so there are two ways to see it, and both can sort of simultaneously be true. It depends on what China's goals are. It depends on how things play out in the next couple decades, blah, 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 blah. But I'm curious if you've put any thought into those two sides of two different views on how China plays into this. I just realized now, actually, Alex, that I went on a tangent and asked about, sorry. I was like, let's be positive, but then also I started talking about China. So I'm sorry I went on a tangent. Let's start with I guess, how might the U.S. do well, and we'll get into China. I don't know how much time you have. I don't want to be too greedy.
I'm free to go. You're our timekeeper. We can go as long as you're able to.
Great.
I know you have a hard out
for our listeners. Yeah, well, actually, it's moved back, so I'm picking up someone from the airport, but their flight got delayed, so I have like an extra 20 minutes.
Cool. Unfortunate,
great.
But
I will also
cool.
note that if you're it's good for us. I will also note that if you're watching and you saw me spaz out like 10 or 15 minutes ago, it's because I got a really bad leg cramp. Like
I didn't want to draw attention to it while we were recording, but I was going to text you after and be like, "Hey, dude, you good?"
No, I just got done. I had like a crazy session at the gym today, and like my leg just decided to cramp up on me really bad, but it's okay now.
Yeah.
But no anyway, let's get back into
okay.
Let's get back into it. So, how might this be good? How might we find a happy ending to this conflict?
So
relatively
I have to start with this, unfortunately. You and I were trained together in basic international affairs at Columbia University in our undergrad. If you knew me then you know that I was a realist in the classic realist school, neorealism, Kenneth Waltz, from the start, and I still am today, although highly modified. And optimism is not one of our strong suits, to put it mild. So I believe that we have no good options. There is no good out for us, only least bad ones. But I can still try to find one. I do not believe.
What is then the least bad?
Yeah, least bad. I mean, in a fantasy world where my recommendations were accepted by the decision makers, we focus on guaranteeing freedom of navigation through the Straits of Hormuz, and get while the getting's good on the Iranian war. We need to cut it off now and focus on the freedom of navigation. That is a disciplined political choice. That means whoever makes that decision will take a hard political loss, because it will be read as a defeat for the United States. But I think that this is a situation of you take a hit now so that you can avoid taking a worse one later. I think that is the good out. That is the good end for us. Is we say, we've degraded Iran's capacity to be a threat to Israel for a very long time. As far as we're concerned, they have no capacity in the near future to recover their nuclear program. We can call these things a victory. Just focus on freedom of navigation through the Straits of Hormuz, and stop trying to prosecute a war in Iran. That fixes the energy crisis problem, which is our biggest threat in the near term. Long term, I think that some damage to our role as a leader of the world order has already been made. I do not think that we are at risk anytime soon of losing our hegemony. I think that we will be a hegemon in the world for many decades to come. We will still be a superpower. We will not be the next Venezuela anytime soon, right? That's just not in the cards. So I think the optimistic thing that I can say is that no matter how bad this war goes, we will be fine. You know, in the long run, we will still
Mm-hmm.
have high quality of living. We will still have tremendous wealth. We will still have access to the consumer goods that we want. We may have less access in the future than we have now or than we hoped we would have in the early 2000s, but we'll be fine. This is not an existential war for us. We are not about to receive missiles raining down upon our heads.
Right.
Our power will still be vast. That's the optimistic reading that I can offer. Is that this is not the end of the world. We'll be okay. Regarding China, I've put a lot of thought into China. I kind of dropped a little hint
Mm.
of it in our last interview. um, and it has become ridiculously more relevant over the last. When did we last speak? About 5 weeks ago.
Something
Um,
like that. Yeah.
Something like that. Ridiculously more relevant. I said then that China had intense interests both in Iran and in Saudi Arabia. That they were trying to complete a pipeline across Iran so that they could pump Iranian oil across Central Asia into China. That plan has been completely ruined, not just by the American war in Iran, but also by the war between Pakistan and the Taliban in Afghanistan, which has gone through an entire conflict cycle in the time that we've been watching the Iran war, and has been ridiculously undercovered because it's overshadowed by the larger one. But the Iranian influence, the Chinese influence in the region is really deep. It goes as deep as here's an example. The traffic light system in Yanbu. Yanbu is a port on the western coast of Saudi Arabia, so it's in the Red Sea, not the Straits of Hormuz. Therefore, it is not cut off by the Iranians. There are still ships traveling up and down. The Houthis have closed the southern end or have tried to close the southern end of the Red Sea at the Bab el Mandab. But for us to import petroleum from Yanbu, you just go north through the Suez Canal. There's no trouble there, right? Yanbu, the traffic light
Mm-hmm.
system is controlled by a Chinese state-owned company, right? So they have access to technological infrastructure in these cities that they could, if they so chose, completely ruin Saudi petroleum exports through a completely different avenue, right? That's just one example of the extensive network of control and influence that China has cultivated in this region. And yet, Chinese tankers are not allowed through the Straits of Hormuz. As much influence as they have with with the government of Iran, as much influence as they have with oil-producing countries around Iran, um, Chinese tankers are not free to navigate, and they have no means of making them free. Um, if they could pick up the phone and get their tankers out, they would have. They have no naval capacity to
Mm-hmm.
go in and conduct freedom of navigation operations themselves. So this is yet
Yes.
another example of just how little brute strength and hard power can get you, um, compared
Mm-hmm.
to the power of relationships across governments. The
Yes.
United States
Yes.
fostered relationships across all of these governments. We're still getting our oil, even though it costs us a hell of a lot to do. They're shipping it in trucks from the eastern coast of the Gulf of Saudi Arabia, the eastern Saudi coast, shipping it in trucks to pipeline ports to go to the Yanbu port and out. We're still getting it. China's not.
Mm-hmm. Um, And again, I think we actually talked about this in our last conversation. People will say China's got this giant military, or excuse me, this giant navy, and that's true, but they have basically no expeditionary. I can't. Oh my god. They have no ability to project power outside of their coastline. Because I was struggling with that word, I'll avoid it. They are trying to fix that with this sort of string of pearls theory, where they develop ports and things like that, sort of along the coastline of South and Southeast and Southern Asia in all kinds of ways, and that's interesting. But it's also extremely vulnerable because you just cut off a couple links
And
in
it's
that
not
chain, and
going
it's
well.
done
I don't
for.
know how closely you follow the process,
And
but
it's
it's
not
not
going
going well
well.
for them.
So they will not have that ability. Point being, anytime soon. So while they do have a certain amount of hard power in the way that you were talking about, they are also lacking in other areas that we excel in. And it should also be noted that the reason, and I agree with you, we will be fine for decades. The thing that I think will degrade is the extent to which we can exert our will globally. It's not that we won't be best able to do it when compared with other nations. It's that the deficit between us and the next kind of couple players will shrink a concerning amount. But the reason that we have that number one spot at all is really because of our Navy, more than anything else. It's our Navy has global reach. We can put Marines anywhere. We can put an anti-missile system that's located on a ship, that's like parked on a ship anywhere, basically in the world. We can patrol oceans. We have aircraft carriers, so we can put planes anywhere in the world because they can just ship them out on a ship. This is an extremely crucial part of our ability to project power globally. So the fact that China can't do it is extremely meaningful. Or the fact that literally pretty much no one else can do it is extremely meaningful. But yeah, I think your take on China is one that is very interesting. Your take on the fact that you don't see an optimistic scenario at all, just a least pessimistic scenario, I think concerns me and is interesting. I will offer a somewhat optimistic scenario, but though I suppose it is kind of a least bad, and that is we get into a much less risky Cold War with Iran. And it's much less risky because they don't have nukes. And if we manage to sort of wall them off, if we can somehow get control of the Strait of Hormuz and then just kind of settle in for a kind of siege or Cold War with them, where we just kind of wait it out and be like, all right, we have control of the strait. That was by far your biggest leverage point. We've completely incapacitated your so-called axis of resistance in the Middle Eastern region. Hamas is done for. The Hezbollah is a shadow of its former self, so on and so forth. I could see that being a kind of relatively good scenario. It might not be for all kinds of interesting reasons for Iranians on the ground in Iran, but for, literally everyone else in the region, the Arab states, Israel, and then, of course, us, Turkey. It's like, great, we've kind of contained them. And we just have this policy of containment until the day that we can start to leverage some real change. And that might be a long time, but it might be worth waiting for. It might be worth the investment to just keep their ability to cause chaos just diminished and clamped down. I feel like we could maybe keep that up for a while, and it would be well worth doing so, because a Middle East where Israel and the Arab states get along, and that issue is put to bed, is actually one that could really prosper. And I should say a Middle East that doesn't have to worry about Iran meddling in everything, right?
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of legs on that view. That is the view that is taken by one of the leading experts on Iran in the English language right now is a man called Karim Sajidpour, who you'll find doing a lot of interviews right now for obvious reasons. He did an interview yesterday with Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart of the Rest is Politics podcast in England, where he expressed exactly the same. Oh yeah, they're great. Yeah. So they had him on, and he expressed exactly the same view that you just did, that there is a potential for a containment policy that is probably the least bad option, I am almost there. I really am. I just have this one piece about the role of international cooperation and whether we have the long-term capacity to maintain it. There are a lot of things that we can
Mm,
do in the short term, but our long-term capacity to do things is seriously hampered right now. Whether or not it will remain so is up for debate. But we have this situation right now where our domestic political culture is not conducive to long-term foreign policy planning. Our executive is cut off from the experience and expertise within our military and diplomatic corps. Um, there are military analysts and diplomats who have been saying for years that an open conflict like this with Iran will close the Straits of Hormuz, will cause an energy crisis, and yet our decision makers seem to have been surprised by this outcome, right? So they're cut
mhm.
off from that body of knowledge and technical skill that is necessary to coordinate long-term policy. And in order to restore that in a permanent way, we could restore it maybe by picking a least bad choice in a couple election cycles, but in a permanent way, we're looking at a cultural reckoning for how we do politics amongst the citizens ourselves, right? And without that, it is difficult
Mhm.
for me to imagine any international strategy that is maintained with effectiveness, capacity, and skill for more than a decade.
How do you think that happens? Like, what's a reasonable path towards? I'm sure it would involve a much less Trumpy MAGA person assuming office and having some influence. But there are other things that need to happen in terms of our relationship with
Yeah.
the Europeans. Our relationship with the Israelis is pretty damn good right about now. But with other allies to build back a lot of trust and a lot of willingness to work in as a team, right?
Yeah.
And so how do we do that?
This is going to be unsatisfying. Um, but it starts with the people. It starts with us. It starts with American citizens and the way we choose to do politics between ourselves, right? We're so damn polarized
Hmm.
right now that we do not have the capacity to consistently elect good leaders, right? We might have one election cycle where we make a good choice for a leader. The next election cycle, chances are we won't, right? Um, how do we as a society produce enough people with the character qualities and intelligence that we need to put into our public service to elect to positions of leadership or to go into our civil service? These are deep questions that are generational. I am of the class of thinkers who believe that there have been strong global trends since the 1970s that have undermined our ability to do this as a culture. Um, uh, Lest you think that I'm making the Marxist critique of late stage capitalism, one of these trends has been the degradation of community institutions like churches, right? As people leave churches and secularize, we
Yeah.
lose one of the mediating institutions between the people and power. I know I'm using a lot of jargon, but I'm trying to crunch for time, you know? Um, so we
Well,
have
actually, their
cultural
flight got
problems.
delayed, so we have a little bit more time because their flight keeps getting
Amazing. Yeah.
delayed. So
Yeah. Okay. I'd like to just make a plug for this mediating institution idea and talk about it for maybe 5 minutes because I
by
think
all
it's so
means,
core. Yeah.
go
It's
for it.
so core to what I think is actually causing these big problems around the world is this mediating institution thing. Um, we live in a society right now where the average American feels pretty cut off from our government, pretty cut off and alienated from our ability to control what our government does. We tend to think as a culture that politicians are shitbags that don't make good decisions, that are in it for themselves. And most of us kind of just wash our hands of the whole politics thing, right? Except maybe during a
Yeah. Gee, I wonder
presidential
why.
election. Yeah, exactly, right? Um, Epstein, right? So,
Yeah.
so, um, the reason that we feel this way is in part, there are a lot of overarching trends, but this mediating institution is a big one. Mediating institution issue is a big one. When we have a social need as a people, a societal need for a government to do something, right? Let's say in the state of Georgia, I want a certain patch of forest to be reserved as a state park. Let's just throw that out there. In order to actually get that done, what I need is a bunch of different people all across the state to, at the same time, go and pressure our leaders to designate this area as a state park. But I have no way of communicating with them, right? I can't pick up the phone and contact 2 million other Georgians to make this happen. What I
Right.
need is a place that I go all the time anyway, regardless of politics, in which I know people, that is organized structurally so that it's connected with other groups like it, where I can go and talk to
Mm-hmm.
buddies that I
Mm-hmm.
know and say, hey, shouldn't we have that as a state park? And whoever is in charge of this
Mm-hmm.
organization will say, you know what? I know a guy over there. If this is a church, I can talk to other people at my church and say, I kind of want that to be a state park. Talk to our pastor. Our pastor can pick up the phone and call another church, right? Another
Mm-hmm.
example of these kinds of
So you're
institutions on the
talking.
left. Go ahead.
Wait, well, just real quick. So what you're talking about, basically, in other words, is access to networks.
Yeah,
It's a node of a network where an average person it could go in and say, I want this to be a park. I want to put a stop sign on the street, whatever it is. And that message, that will, gets plugged into this network, and networks are powerful. That's kind of what it
yes,
is. So if you could
precisely that.
literally think of like nodes that are all connected, and you just enter into one of those nodes, and it lights up all the other nodes, right?
Exactly.
And churches are a great example of this. I'll also say it just you're reminding me a lot of Bowling Alone,
Yes, bowling
right?
alone is one of the
Societies, like
key
civil.
texts in
Yeah.
this idea that I'm building out. Another example
Mm.
besides
Right.
churches is unions, right? Unions are kind of collapsing.
Mm-hmm.
Used to be you could get your union rep to call other members of other unions and organize this. The one place that we still have in our society that's going strong, where we actually have these networks, is your job, right? It's someplace that you go every day, you know the people, there's a hierarchy, you can do that. The problem is that our jobs are private companies, and private companies have their interests in profit and growth, right? It's rare that private companies will
Mm-hmm.
prioritize a broad social political goal over something that benefits the company. So it's not as useful, although there is some utility there. Um, but the degradation of these kinds of organizations, their loss, is a huge factor in why we get poor leadership now. The quality of our politicians is just trash because we just don't have the social power to coordinate across these networks of people across party lines. One great example of these kind of nodes that you're talking about is there used to be party Little League baseball. Used to be the Little League Democrats and the Little League Republicans. Uh, and
Mm-hmm.
they would play each other or play internally, and their parents would communicate, right? They would see each other regularly. So that was another great
Right.
example of this. And we just don't have that anymore with the advent of the internet and the algorithm. So,
And
you know,
the little league libertarians would play and get walloped every time.
every single time. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
But so my point that I'm trying
Yeah.
to make with this rant that I'm on is that this is one example of 3 or 4 huge, broad social trends
Mm-hmm.
that are hitting the
Mm-hmm.
entire world. And until
Yes.
we can figure out what to do about these, I'm pretty pessimistic about our ability to be consistent on other big policy issues in the long run, right?
Right.
So that's where the focus of my political thought is.
Right. I will just say, if it sounds like we've gone off topic and you're listening, we really haven't. Because the point, Alex, that you're making here is that international policy, so foreign policy, is a downstream effect of domestic situations. I'm not even going to say domestic policy. It's culture. It's political situations. It's the heart of what is going on in that particular nation. So everything is connected to everything else. I mean, that it is downstream of culture. I'm sorry, politics is downstream of culture. And so if the culture is messed up, the domestic politics will be messed up. If the domestic politics is messed up, it's going to have a negative effect on the foreign policy, generally speaking. And I agree with you. I actually completely agree with you. I think there's so much more that ties into this. It's not just people becoming more secular, not going to church, people not joining unions as much. It's what plays into this is the fact that people are online way more. You talk about the workplace. I work completely remotely, so I actually don't go into work. I go into my office that I'm sitting in right now. And just do my work here and stay home a lot. I will say, like, that exercise I was just doing that caused me to cramp up earlier. My wife and I go to this, like, it's this thing called Burn Boot Camp. My wife started doing it and she wanted me to come along, so I started doing it. And that's like one of those rare places, actually, interestingly, that is like an exception to the rule, where like we're meeting people, we're like talking to other couples and, you know, people with kids and blah, 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 blah. So I do think it exists in interesting pockets, but it is largely degraded, as is pointed out in Bowling Alone. People don't join bowling leagues. That's where the title comes from, nearly as often. So you don't have these like recreational leagues and blah, 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 blah. So let me finish. Actually, my thought is the internet plays a big part in this, especially with young people. As young people aren't going out as much, you get articles all the time talking about how, you know, 16 to 18-year-olds aren't fucking anymore, and that this is a problem, which I understand, actually. Like, that makes sense. Like, they're not going out and having fun. They're not partying. And it was bad when they're partying too much, but we don't want them to be shut-ins either, right? And so the internet and social media plays a huge role in this. But I get this feeling, like, deep in my gut, that something is on the horizon culturally that is a sort of reaction to increased loneliness, a reaction to, and this maybe is me being far too optimistic. I will fully acknowledge that.
No,
but a
I
reaction
think you're
to
absolutely right.
Not getting laid, right? Like, how often, like we worry about these kids in the manosphere, like getting plugged into the so-called manosphere and, you know, paying attention to Andrew Tate and all those guys. But you know what the truth is? Half of those guys are actually just gay, and the other half that are straight are assholes. And if you pay attention to them, you're actually not going to get laid. And so sooner or later, at least not with young ladies. And so sooner or later, these young guys especially, are gonna figure out, like, this isn't working. And young women are gonna figure out, like, I'm kind of done with, like, man hating, because, like, I understand that it's not a fair world and guys can be assholes, definitely, but I still, like, want a boyfriend. And young kids are going to figure out, like, you know, like, video games are fun, but I kind of miss getting sunlight. And I just get this, like, sense that there's going to be a reaction to all this, and that young people especially are going to be like, fuck this. I want to go play baseball with my friends. I'm going to go ride my bike. I'm going to go to that party, get a little drunk, not too drunk, hopefully, and hit on that girl. And maybe she rejects me, but that's okay, because I'm trying. Like, that is kind of the childhood that I had. You know, let me tell you, a lot of rejections, but, you know, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. But yeah. But I, like, had, like, a social life, and I think kids are going to want that again. And when they start to do that when they're young, it's going to carry on into their adult lives. And I can see a rebound. And you know what, weirdly enough, the thing that made me feel this more than anything else, and I will say this is tied into, I think, what will eventually become also a sort of red, white, and blue pilling of the youth, is the term I like to use, right? Is like, they're going to be rah pro-America a little bit more in a very positive way. Is that I also think people are going to get tired of hearing either, this country is inherently racist and sexist, and if you don't hate America, then you're a bad person, and you're racist and horrible. And also, I should say, Israel and the Jews are ruining this country. Or hearing, this country is being ruined by immigrants and minorities, and like, the elites hate you, and we're all screwed because we're abandoning Christianity, and also the Jews are controlling our government. And so I'm pointing out that, unfortunately,
it's funny how they always get screwed, right?
On both sides,
no matter what.
It's always the Jews. It doesn't matter. Yeah, both sides of the horseshoe, right? I think that kids are gonna get tired of hearing that too, and they're gonna be like, you know what, America's pretty great. For all its problems, we have abundant wealth and opportunity more than most other people in most other parts of the world for all of human history.
Yeah.
And I just get a sense that this combination of being tired of being lonely, being tired of being negative, being tired of being told that we live in a horrible world that's going to, be destroyed by climate change or whatever, and blah, 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 and that our country's horrible. I think people are just going to get this like burnout on all of that negative messaging, hateful messaging. And I can see like culture is reactionary, and I can see a reaction to this negativity being one that is actually positive. That could be complete bullshit. Like I said, I just feel it. And the thing that made me feel it most recently, and I'll stop after this, is watching our boys and our ladies, I should say, both teams in the Olympics, the Winter Olympics, winning the gold medal, the hockey gold
Hell
medal.
yeah.
Was
Hell yeah.
awesome to see. It was awesome. It was awesome to see that kid with his teeth knocked out talking about how great America is. It was awesome to put those smug Canadians in their place. All due respect to Canadians, I do love you, but you can get a little pretentious sometimes. It was rad, and I just think if more of that starts happening, yeah. Well, they also think they're morally superior to us, and they're not. But yeah, I just think it's. I can see that happening. Rant over. I don't know if you think that's completely delusional or not. I'm just curious.
Actually, I think this is I couldn't have thought of a better, direction for closing remarks for us on this. I think you're absolutely right. I think you're 100% right on one aspect, and the other aspect is a coin toss worth fighting to get landed on what we want it to land on. What you're absolutely, I think I'm 100% there with you on is that we're kind of sick of this shit, right?
Yeah.
And there is change happening. I think it's already happening. And one great example of it is I hate using this word, but it's the word that everybody knows is wokeism, right? Um, just a minor diversion on this word. I grew up around a lot of these old black dudes who came out of the civil rights movement or the Black Panther movement, who were in their 70s at the time in the 90s when I was a kid, and they used this word. This was their word, right? Stay woke was something that I grew up listening to these old heads say to young black men. And what they're trying to say was, something along the lines of don't be an idiot, be aware of your surroundings, be aware of the situation that you're in this country, and don't be an idiot, right? And every time I hear somebody use the word wokeism in our current discourse, I just feel bad for the memory of these old guys who, we're talking about something completely different, and it just doesn't.
Yeah.
It's a me thing, right? It's a me thing, but like I just hate using that word because I feel like I'm disrespecting those guys. But anyway, another term for it is hyper-identity politics. Again, I'm stealing from the political philosopher Vlad Vexler. I think the age of hyper-identity politics is over. It was a flash in the pan and it's burned itself out. I think that our biggest risk over the next decade is going to be a backlash to that, where white supremacists use the same methods and techniques, the victimization, institutionalization of race. I think we're going to see a push for that. That's something we're going to have to watch out for into the 2030s. But I think that largely it's over. And change is here. People are tired of this kind of cultural bullshit. The question is what comes next. And in order to land on the healthy civic nationalism you were just talking about, this red, white, and blue, feeling bonded to the concept of being an American, I think we're desperately in need of that. The path to get there isn't a guarantee, I think. It is a good likelihood. I think we've got a good shot of landing there, might be even more than 50% of landing there as a culture. But part of my project that I'm working on now, part of the reason I wrote that Charlie Kirk essay back then was to try and map out what it is that we need to do to get there, right? Um, because I want to have a situation again where I can pick anybody in America who disagrees with me politically and just trust that we both love the fact that we're both Americans, right? We have this bond of civic nationalism. I want to see that, and I want to figure out what we need to do to build that. Um, that's part of my philosophical project that I'm working on. So I think that
Yeah.
future
And
is great. Has a great shot of manifesting. I'm pretty optimistic about that. If we work it.
I'll say this: our next conversation has to be exclusively about civic nationalism because it's something that also greatly interests me, and I agree with you completely that A, it is worth fighting for, and B, it has the potential to be won. Like that we could win that fight is what I'm trying to say. And actually achieve a kind of culture that really values civic nationalism as opposed to all the other much inferior forms of nationalism, particularly like race-based nationalism, right? Um, uh, and that it's worth fighting for, that we could get it, and that I'm very interested to know what that path looks like and what you think that path looks like, what I think it looks like, and kind of brainstorm how we might get there. But anyway, we did get a little off topic from Iran.
We did, yeah.
I actually think the thing I really want to end on, and we did, but the thing I really want to end on is we haven't really paid much lip service to the people in Iran, the people that we lost in January, who were slaughtered. I just read actually a headline today about a Olympic wrestler in Iran who got publicly executed for his participation um, in those protests. And you're also hearing stories about the girls that were granted asylum in Australia who are returning to Iran, which, apologists for the regime have said, have pointed at and said, oh, see, they love Iran. They're going back. And it's like, no, it's because the regime threatened to murder their families. So all that pain is being inflicted on those people by their own regime. And of course, even though it's unintentional, there is some obviously collateral damage from the U.S. and Israel that they're suffering. There's the girls' school that did get hit tragically.
We should talk about the girls' school. Yeah.
I know there was some debate early on, but as far as I know and what I've read so far, it was a missile from the United States, I believe, that was aiming for a target that was close by to that school, missed that target, and accidentally hit the school.
What our Pentagon investigation concluded was that the building used to be within the compound of the military base nearby. We built a target database. After we built that target database, the school was separated out and the wall of the compound was rebuilt. So we had an outdated target database. So we did aim at it. We did shoot it. It was an error. It was not intentional, but almost 200 kids died. And I don't think we get to just kind of gloss over that. And I really wish I had remembered to bring it up earlier. I kind of take that seriously.
I almost forgot myself. No, it is extremely serious. I think it's worth highlighting the point that collateral damage is not necessarily a reason to not go to war. I mean, we wouldn't have gone to war with Nazi Germany or Japan, which were very much just and worthwhile wars worth fighting,
right.
if we weren't willing to accept the fact that civilians would die. Doesn't make it any less tragic. I think what is particularly tragic about that girls' school and the other Iranian civilians that have been killed is that it's not entirely clear, to put it mildly, that this was a necessary or ultimately beneficial conflict. It's hard to know the alternative reality. I think we spoke about this last time too, where we don't go to war with Iran. Maybe it is worse, but it's not eminently clear by any means that this was necessary.
Yeah.
A strong argument could be made that it was. A very strong argument could be made that it wasn't.
Even if it was necessary, I feel that it would be right for us as a nation to maybe do something like set aside a victims fund for the families of those girls, right? We obviously, this is a politically complicated thing. We have to make sure that the money doesn't reach the hands of the regimes. But I feel like we can't just walk away. I mean, yes, it was an accident, but like if I'm driving the speed limit and a kid jumps out in front of my car and I kill him, I'm not evil for that, but I can't just fucking walk away. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but you're a good person if you try to do something,
Yeah.
however insignificant compared to the tragedy.
Right.
If you try to do something about it, right? Same thing. I don't know if you listened to one of our episodes. I went out of my way to contact one of my Persian friends to help me with my Farsi, which is very bad, non-existent, effectively.
Oh, I thoroughly enjoyed watching you do that.
Struggle through it, really bad. And I'm just going to say that basically the same thing in English that I said in it's interesting. I call it Farsi. I've been told that in English you should say Persian, that's actually correct, but other people will say no, it's called Farsi. I don't really know. Persian Farsi is the term I'll use. I'll say the same thing in English that I said in Persian Farsi, which is the Iranian people deserve to be free, and the whole world would benefit greatly from an Iran that is free and prosperous. And even though we've been sort of somewhat pessimistic in this conversation, I hope that we're being overly pessimistic. I hope that our pessimism is entirely misplaced. I hope that the people rise up, and I know you do too. And I hope that we see a free Iran for all sorts of reasons that would be good for them and good for the world. So,
Yeah. I think that's a great closing note.
I think it's a good place to end it. Thanks for joining me, Alex. Thanks for inviting me to do this conversation. This was super fun,
thank
as
you,
it was
Clay.
last
This was
time.
great. Yeah, let's do it again. Let's talk about civic nationalism in a couple months, maybe.
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
Yeah.
All right, brother.
All right.
For a soft